I wonder what you had for breakfast today. Was it waffles, toast, avocado toast? You know you're hip when you're eating avocado toast for breakfast. What about leftover salmon croquettes? We are a people who are storied by the food that we eat. Actually, we're comprised of it, saturated with it. Not just in our bodies, though, but in our spirit. We're created by a creator who designed us for nutritional living. Everything that we do in life requires it. And so, what happens when the very sustenance that we need is just continually out of reach? What happens when we are doing everything within our power to just scrape by, and it's still not enough? And I wonder if maybe we haven't been a little guilty in the church of trying to proclaim good news with bad food, or with no food at all. That's a key ingredient, by the way, that separates us from the Gnostics, you know. We serve a God who is present with us in the potluck. There's a reason Jesus taught and fed people, and it wasn't with a Happy Meal. Are you with me? Welcome to the Eco-Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Caleb Cray Haynes, and today we're joined by theologian, author, food justice strategist, Reverend Yvette R. Blair-Lavallais, and we're digging into the issues of food justice and, as always, what it means to be Christian on planet Earth. And today, particularly Texas.
All right, friends, I'm here with my new friend, Yvette. She is a wonderful food justice advocate and doing the Lord's work out in Dallas. Reverend Doctor Yvette, so it's pronounced Yvette, which I want to get into in a minute, R. Blair-Lavallais. So she's with me here. She's a licensed pastor and ordained elder in the Methodist Church, and she has served in pastoral ministry for almost 15 years in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area, including the honor of having served as the first woman in the role of senior pastor at First Christian Methodist Church in the Redbird area of Dallas, which is so cool. She completed the 2-year Women in Ministry cohort at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey and holds a certificate in executive leadership. Currently, she serves on the ministerial team at Greater Garth Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Dallas, and is an adjunct faculty member at Memphis Theological Seminary down the road from me, and where she teaches Theologies of the Land in the doctoral program. Yvette is a womanist public theologian and food justice strategist. She earned a doctor of ministry from Memphis Theological Seminary in May of 2022, and her work focuses on the intersection of food insecurity, famines, displacement, and gentrification of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples. Man, I love all that so much. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Oh, man, it's my pleasure. You know, I was just reading online on your website and all the work that you've been up to, and I just had to catch my breath because you are driven, and I love that so much. You've got some irons in the fire. So, and you're also an editor, right?
I am. I'm also an editor. I wear many hats. One of my really good friends calls me the book doula because I also help ministers who are looking to take their manuscripts and turn them into books. So I kind of help through the birthing process of the writing, if you will. So yes.
Well, I need some of that in my life. So we're going to have to talk about that. That's great. That's really great. So yeah, maybe a good starting place, kind of a gets to know you question. But I've seen a little bit of your writing, and you talk about your name. And I know a lot of people, you know, when they see they see your name, they don't pronounce it Yvette, right? And so there's kind of an intentionality happening there. Would you care to maybe share a little bit of that?
Absolutely. I love to talk about my origin story. So when my parents named me, they named me Yvette. They said that the Y is not silent because they believed that God was going to use me to be a prophetic voice. And so I try to live into that calling of my name every single day in the work that I do. When you think biblically, during the biblical times when people were named, there was a certain meaning that went behind their name. And so they had to live out that name. And so that's what I try to do. I try to be a prophetic voice and to speak up for people who are made marginalized. I also try to speak out against injustices and just really amplify my voice and raise awareness about different things that are going on in our communities, whether it's local or global. So definitely the Y is not silent. I am not.
Oh, man. I hope the Y is not silent for any of us. Am I right? I mean, it's like, that's it. Yeah. So take us back a little bit as far as you care to go. And I know it's kind of a tricky question because there's no such thing really as separating out our stories into bite-sized pieces or anything. But yeah, I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your eco journey, and especially as it's tied with your faith as a Christian and what you feel God is calling you to be up in the world, and how that sort of got entangled with some of this.
Absolutely. So anytime I enter into a space and talk about the work that I do, I always like to recognize the land that I'm on. So here in Dallas, Texas, I am on the Wichita and Caddo and Comanche land, and I think it's always important to name that. I also like to name my maternal ancestors when I come into any space because I recognize that I don't come by myself, and particularly as a woman. So I like to name Matilda Berry. I am the 6th great-granddaughter of Matilda Berry, who made her way all the way from Arkansas to Texas in the mid-1800s. And her daughter is listed on the U.S. Census as head of household and as a farmer. So I feel like my story literally begins there because there's actual documentation and evidence that shows that. And so when I think about that against the sense of being a little kid and going to my grandparents' home in East Texas on my mother's side, and just spending so much time with my siblings and my cousins, just running on the land. I mean, there was 52 acres of land that my grandparents owned in East Texas. And summers were just amazing. We did fishing. We were catching, the little lightning bugs and just all the fun things that kids would do. And so it never really occurred to me until sometime later how that really was like the grounding for me, if you will, and just this sense of the connection to the land and to the earth and just what that means. And so even as I matured and became an adult, there was just always this sense of wanting to be outside and just this connection and just feeling this sense of nature and understanding that creation is a part of us and that we are in partnership with creation, and just recognizing the beauty of what God does. And so that really became sort of the guiding force for me, if you will. And then when I began to look at what are some injustices that people are experiencing, whether it's environmental injustice, when you have people who live in areas where there's not the quality of air that they need, and so it affects their health. When you look at where people live, and especially here in Dallas, I remember that there was a lead smelter smack dab in the middle of a neighborhood of predominantly Black and Hispanic people. And just thinking about how that affected their health. And that's an environmental concern. And then also what it does for the soil. So when you have lead and it's seeping into the soil, it also affects the environment. So even there was always this curiosity for me of why is this happening and really what's the root cause of it. And so that drives everything that I do.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. just weaving your story there. And I think that's the important thing that in my work I'm always trying to kind of, it's kind of like taking a pulse and remember that it first happens in a way of love, and you telling your story about, kind of like quote unquote falling in love with creation, in your youth, and that love becomes justice.
Yes.
And I think that's the path that, I almost say God intended, that love does become justice. And if it doesn't, like, how much is it really loving in a world that's, obviously has lots of broken places, particularly environmentally. So I love that you sort of trace that narrative that way, because I think that's a stark reminder for us. So yeah. So obviously I left for us to get into your book. So my friends listening, Scrimpin and Scrapin, the hardships of hustle, women and food insecurity in Texas through a womanist lens. So good. So the book addresses, talks about the root causes of food insecurity through a faith lens, which I saw that when it came out, when it debuted, it was like #1 new release on Amazon and #4 bestseller. Like, man, that's epic. So, and this kind of came out of your doctoral research, is that right?
So it's an amazing journey, and it did come out of my doctoral research. So one of the things that was happening for me is my doctoral research actually is on reframing the narrative of food insecurity, and instead of calling them food deserts, really talking about it through the lens of food apartheid, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so as I was doing the research, I just saw that there was not a lot of research and scholarship from persons in the Black, Indigenous, people of color community. And I remembered reading something from Toni Morrison, the great literary giant Toni Morrison, who said, if you can't find the book that you want and that you need, then maybe you have to write it. And so I would not recommend anybody doing this, but simultaneously, while I was writing my dissertation, I was also over here on this side writing this book. And it really became critical for me being in Texas, because a lot of people think that Texas is this rich state because we hear, cattle and ranches and cowboy hats and all these things. Texas is this grand state. Well, Texas is also the tale of two cities. There's a lot of poverty that exists in Texas, and people often don't know that. There is Presidio County in the southwestern part of the state that has the highest food insecurity rate in the country. And it's right here in Texas, and people don't realize that. And so as I was doing this research, and just also understanding that women are disproportionately affected by food insecurity. And so I wanted to use my journalism background and to begin to interrogate and do interviews and to hear real lived experiences of people, because numbers are one thing and it does tell a story. But I think when you hear actually from the people who are experiencing food insecurity, it tells a whole different story because you're hearing it directly from them. And so that's what I did. I spent time traveling throughout Texas and just randomly stopping people. Because again, I mean, as a minister, as a journalist, I don't mind stopping and having conversation with people and just introducing them and saying, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, and would you mind telling your story? So I would literally see people in grocery stores, like trying to decide if they're going to buy this versus that, or just, sort of doing what I call holy eavesdropping, just kind of listening in. And as they began to share what was happening, then it raised the question for me, like, as a person of faith, how is it that we are witnesses to what's happening and we simply say, oh, let's just pray about it, or, God is going to make a way somehow? The question really becomes, how do we become ecclesial disruptors of the root causes of this? And I have to say that term ecclesial disruptors comes from my good friend, Reverend Doctor Teresa Smallwood. She served as the director of the public theology and racial justice cohort at Vanderbilt Divinity School there in Nashville. And I had a chance to be a part of that inaugural cohort that was back 2018 to 2020. And when I started this work, she and I were having a conversation, and she said, Yvette, ask the question, how do we become ecclesial disruptors? And that just stuck with me. Just hearing that, right? Ecclesial, because we think of ecclesia and we think of church. And so as a people of faith, how do we respond to how God is calling us to show up at these intersections as people of faith and to respond in a way that honors God and that does justice, like the prophet Micah says? So that's what this book is all about. It's really looking at the root causes. Everything is grounded in Genesis 1:29, where God says, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is up on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. To me, that says that food insecurity is antithetical to the gospel, because God has clearly provided a mandate, a policy, if you will, that there's always going to be food. And so when we find that there are people, our neighbors, who are without food, it's antithetical to the gospel. And then we have to begin to ask the question, why is it that certain people have access to food and other people don't? Listen, stop me at any point, because I'd be very fascinated.
No, this is like going for the extra touchdown at this point. Roll on, this is so good.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, and so from there, then, I talk about, I give definitions, of course, and so that it brings people into the conversation, particularly persons of faith who may not understand what food insecurity is. I give some clear examples of what that means. I talk about how it's a household economic condition of being food insecure, meaning that, you don't have the money to be able to afford to have a meal. And then I also invite people into the conversation to hear from the different real lived experiences that people have. I talk historically about, food banks, food pantries, and how the first food pantry started in the church. So there's that piece. But then also looking at what are some more things that we can do other than saying, okay, let's just go and stock these food pantries, but really looking at food insecurity through a policy level. And that sort of challenges the faith community a little bit, because when we hear policy, we're like, oh no. But I always remind people that when you look at Acts 2:42 and see what the early church was doing, and what it says that they shared everything that they had in common, literally that was policy that they put in place to make sure that everybody had something. And so it's the same thing that God is calling us to do.
I think that's a really helpful framing, because I think part of the thing that I do think is kind of creates a mobilization is that there is, admittedly, it's so big, it's hard to know where to start, and it's hard to know if you're doing the right things. And I think that's what's so helpful about your research, is because you're kind of shining a light onto it and kind of getting down into the nitty gritty. And so I love the localizedness of your research, and particularly, women of color experiencing food injustice in, these rural areas of Texas, because I believe that we often get so stuck in the clouds and attempt to do the work of environmental and social justice from too high of an altitude sometimes, and never sort of grounding it anywhere, kind of like we're talking about. Right. And then it just ends up really unrooted and unfruited. And so, I wonder if we rewind a little bit. I love how you brought up the Genesis 1:29, and I think that's a cool place I love talking about Genesis, and it's, I think it's really helpful, even as this sort of ancient poetic, narrative about our creation, but it informs who we are and who we believe we are and what it means to be obviously created in the image of God, and this idea of this sort of theological connection around food justice, and I believe you call it like a good food theology lens or something like that around none of us were ever meant to be separated from our food, from growing it, tending it, producing it, planting it, harvesting, but even more like we're not just separated from it, but like we were created to do this act. This is like what we are up to as human beings. And then I would even like, and maybe you've probably gotten into some of this too, but I was thinking like when you were talking, it made me think all the way to, right, what we believe about the eschaton and heaven and like this great banquet, right, where there is just like an abundance of food, and the idea of Jesus saying, look, I won't have this again until we do it big later, kind of this like bracketed moment. So anyway, now I'm getting on. So is that kind of what you were kind of getting at a little bit when you're bringing up Genesis, I guess? Is that sort of like good food lens? Is that what you're...
Absolutely. So it's so important that God would include this in part of the creation story of making sure that there's always going to be fruit-bearing trees that we can have for food. And so it is this sense of understanding that that's something that all of us are supposed to have access to. And the problem comes when the "your" in this text is misappropriated to say, well, maybe it means some people, but it doesn't mean all people. And so even when you talk about the great banquet, the heavenly banquet, it's like that's inclusive of everyone. And we should concern ourselves and give attention to what's happening right here and now. If we understand that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and everything that's in it and all who dwell in it, then that means that everyone should have access to food. So there shouldn't be any food insecurity. There shouldn't be any persons who are going without access to fresh, healthy, affordable, cultural specific and diet specific foods.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And I think it's so easy to just sort of cruise in survival mode when it comes to food. And of course that's a privileged thing to say, even, as I'm sitting here, but I'm thinking like, there's a lot of complacency with bad food as well, and obviously in places that, that have that sort of lack of access to good, even where I live, I can drive to a grocery store that's a handful of miles away, but outside of that, the only place, like if I were to go on foot for like a mile and a half, there's a McDonald's and then maybe a Subway, and that's it. There's a gas station that I have been known to stop at a few times on work days and get some fried chicken and potato wedges, quote unquote, yes. But that, that's it. And so, right. But that's not, I'm going to make a leap here and say, that's not good food, right? That's not food from the tree.
Right. It's not good food. And I'm so glad you named like stopping at a convenience store, because for some neighborhoods, they don't have a full-scale grocery store. So we know that the U.S. Department of Agriculture says that if there's not a full-scale grocery store within a 1-mile radius in an urban area and a 10-mile radius in a rural area, then that particular community is said to be in a food desert, meaning that you don't have access to fresh, healthy food. And I always emphasize it's healthy, because it shouldn't be that a person's only option is to grab something from a convenience store that's been on the warmer or the burner for 2 or 3 hours, at the checkout stand. And it shouldn't be that you're having to go to a place and ordering a number one combo meal and trying to trade out the French fries for a salad. Like, that shouldn't be the only options that we have. And so I think for the faith community, it's important to understand that not every neighborhood has a full-scale grocery store, meaning that it has enough food by volume to support that particular community. Some neighborhoods only have the gas station grocery store. And so if you think about, how am I going to provide food for my family and buy dinner? Am I really going to the corner store, getting gas, and also seeing if there's like fresh food at this particular location for me to be able to cook? The answer is usually no. And so we see that a lot of people are having to travel more than 3, 5, sometimes 10 miles just to be able to get food. And it also raises the question of, does a person even have transportation to be able to do that? So these are things that we wouldn't ordinarily think about because we are in a place of privilege where we don't have to worry about that. Like, I have a car that I can get in and drive to right now, although I live in a declared food desert. Like, the church where I was pastoring is in a declared food desert because the last big box retailer that had been an anchor in our community for 30 years just suddenly one day decided, hey, we're going to close. In 2 weeks, we're gone. And that was it. And so it literally left 10,000 people without access to a full-scale grocery store. I mean, we've got a Target in the area, but Target can't supply everything that 10,000 people in the community need. So it's really helping people to understand that these are the things that are happening that lead and cause food insecurity and cause people to be in the conditions that we are in. And the other thing I would add, which is also critical, is the minimum wage in Texas, where I live, is still $7.25 an hour. There are so many people who don't make a livable wage. And if you don't make a livable wage, you can't afford just basic necessities.
Yeah, it's just unreal that, like, we live in 2024 and in quote unquote like America, and this is still the situation that we're in. But yeah, I love the way that you're reframing that, and I really don't think we, so many of us are just so privileged, and we've never really had to stop and think about the way that this lack of this food insecurity affects every single thing. And and we are talking about choices, right? And it's like, if I'm gonna go if I'm gonna go walk to wherever I gotta go, and that's gonna take most of my day, I'm so that I can get something better for my family to eat or for me to eat, I'm making several choices in that moment to not do all the other things that maybe have to get done. And if I can't even swing that. But then also, I think that there's another level underneath that's just nutrition. And I think we barely even think about what it does to a person's body who has only eaten things that are crunchy and orange for 5 days or something, like, right. And several of us may experience
left on their fingers.
That's right. I went through this phase in college. It doesn't feel good. But no, in reality though, like, what it means to have a body that is experienced long-term and ongoing food insecurity, malnutrition, and what you're going to feel like doing, and how good you're going to be able to quote unquote make your life. And it's so easy to sit on some sort of like high horse and think that I know that happens, right, about areas that are food insecure. And I love that this good piece about your research. You're sort of uncovering some of these onion layers to say,
yes.
No, there's so much more going on here.
Right. There's so much more going on. And you're right when it comes to nutrition. Most of the illnesses that people have, they're diet-related illnesses. So when you think about hypertension and obesity on the one end, malnutrition on the other, it's diet-related. When a person doesn't have access to fresh, healthy food and they're choosing these unhealthy foods, then it's affecting their diet. It's affecting their livelihood. It's affecting their health. And we know that when things begin to affect your health, it also affects how you show up in school. It affects how you show up at work. And so yes, everything. And I also want to name that we're talking about people of all ages. So even when we think about our elderly neighbors, many who are on fixed incomes, and they're having to make these same choices and decisions as well. And so if you think about, our grandparents having to decide, am I going to buy medicine this week, or am I going to be able to buy the food that I need? And so I would hope that people, as they're listening, begin to slow down and to think about, we're not just talking about younger people who are making, irrational decisions. We're talking about older people for whom this is the only decision that they can make.
That's right. And I think that's a good point to sort of like swing back, and because obviously you write about scrimping and scraping, and I think it's important to know, right? You're not referencing, right, necessarily, this is not like a virtue, like this is not, I think we hear that, we think, thrifty, but it's literally having to scrape by. And
that's right.
And this kind of preconceived idea, that we can have, what it means to scrimp and scrape by. And I think that's really helpful terminology for us to think through. You talk about, right, you write about, and I think most of our listeners are probably, or at least maybe, familiar with the term food desert. But you help us sort of frame this conversation more holistically using the language of food apartheid. Could you unpack that and the importance of that distinction for us a bit?
Yes. So this term food apartheid was actually coined by a Black woman in upstate New York, Karen Washington. She's a food justice activist. And she said that when you use the term food apartheid, it looks at all the inequities that are happening in a system. It looks at race, it looks at geography, it looks at economics, and she also says it looks at faith, versus food desert, which could sound like it's a naturally occurring phenomenon that suddenly an area is drying up, which would imply that another area obviously would be a food oasis. And so as long as we use the term food desert, it doesn't call our attention to look at what the root causes are of what's actually happening that we're able to trace and track. But when we say food apartheid, or apartheid, however a person chooses to pronounce it, then it does cause us to get a little bit uncomfortable when we hear that term, but we should be uncomfortable that our neighbors don't have access to anything. So I appreciate that Karen Washington uses that term, because it does pull back the layers on the onion. It causes us to ask, okay, why is it that south of the Trinity River, where I am, that there are only a handful of grocery stores, whereas north of the Trinity River, in more affluent areas, you can have a Whole Foods on one corner, another major grocer chain directly across the street from it, and people have options, but certain neighborhoods don't have those options. And so food apartheid helps to explain that. I would also say, down the street from you in Memphis is the hunger capital of the United States. There are, I mean, when you think about Memphians living in areas where they don't have access to grocery stores, and a lot of people don't have transportation, and so they are relying on public transportation. A lot of times it takes an hour and a half one way just to get to a grocery store. And then imagine you can only buy so much, because you have to think about perishable items, then riding back another hour and a half. And how much can you carry with you? So if it's not your experience, you would never stop to think about that. But that's included in the food apartheid, because it's those kinds of experiences that people are dealing with.
That's such a helpful framing for us to say, hey, there's all these other factors going on here, and this is not just geographical. And
right.
Yeah, absolutely. You share a lot of great stories in the book, especially, of course, the ones that, are connected with you personally, and you write about your own mother sort of hustling out of this place of food insecurity, and I'm sure that that's not the easiest thing to write about, and you talk about your mother and the story about getting a food box, and and address some of the issues underneath sort of the quote unquote food box work. And, and so while there's a ministry there, it's not necessarily, it's kind of always something that I feel like communities and faith communities wrestle with, right? It's not necessarily aiding in lasting food security, obviously, but it also leaves, right, in this situation, it leaves your mom in this instance with some food, but also a lack of control around what's for dinner. And then meanwhile, we're all just told to sort of like be grateful. You know what I'm saying? So there's kind of this tension here. So I'm kind of digging in a little bit more because I'm curious if, I wonder if you could speak to some of that tension as we grapple with, right, what are some of the helpful ecclesial responses to food insecurity can be, and I think, and obviously we can talk more about policy and talk, but I'd love to kind of talk also about sort of this sort of like the food box thing. And yeah.
Absolutely. So I do believe that food pantries and food banks are an important resource to be able to respond to food insecurity that's happening in our neighborhoods. I do talk about the personal story of what was happening with my mom and what happens with so many other people. And that is, it was at a time when somebody else makes a decision of what's going to go into that box. They have no idea what your medical history is, what food allergies you might have. It's somebody somewhere who's made a decision that said in each of these boxes, we're going to put, maybe peanut butter and sardines, and maybe there's going to be 1 or 2 helpings of fresh produce, and literally you're giving it to that person. That reduces the dignity on the person who's receiving it because they didn't have any agency whatsoever in saying, I would like to have this and not this, or I'm allergic to peanuts and can't have peanut butter. And so we don't even think about those things because instead we think, a person should just be happy to get something. That's not a God response by any means. It's not that you should just be happy to get something. And so what we've seen, I think, during the pandemic, and what the pandemic has really amplified and magnified, is that there are so many people now who are having to rely on food pantries and food banks that a lot of these food pantries and food banks have been running low on inventory. And so a lot of times they don't have enough to be able to meet the need, because there is a growing need of people who are becoming more and more food insecure every day. So I appreciate the work that food pantries and food banks are doing. I talk about in the book how the first food pantry started back in 1967 in Arizona, that literally started in a faith community because it started in a church. There was a man who saw a woman who was trying to feed her kids, and she literally was going through the trash, rummaging, trying to find something. And he was like, there should be a place where, like a bank, that a person can come and make a withdrawal because other people have made a deposit. And so that's how we get food banks. But I also want to just, caution and say that it's not enough, because a lot of times it's the same people who are coming back time and time again next week and the week after and the week after, because they just don't have a livable wage. They don't have the means and the resources that they need to be able to afford food on their own without having to come to pantries and food banks.
Mm. So it's a really great point. You name a couple of initiatives that are doing sort of work between sort of like urban farming to sort of like community involvement in urban farming to sort of like local farm stand as sort of a means of income. I wonder, and maybe you're involved in some of that as well. I just wonder what, your sort of hot take on some of that was, and if you've seen, that sort of as a model that churches could engage in, or at least think more critically about creating space. I think one of the things is churches, I feel like, so many churches have just property that's not being used well. And I think that's kind of one piece I'm just kind of spitballing on here, but yeah, what are your thoughts on on some of that sort of the urban farm to table as a means of or an alternative to just doing the food box thing or.
Absolutely. And I think that carries us back to the sense of creation and land, and how do we steward the land that God has given us? Like how are we caregivers? How do we shepherd well this resource of land that God has given to us? And you're right that churches have so much underutilized land, that land is an opportunity for us to be able to respond to food insecurity. So I do work with Grow Southeast in Fort Worth, and it's an organization that works with urban farmers, a lot of them who are a part of faith communities, and really looking at how do you repurpose the land and say that we're going to allow urban growers to utilize this. We're going to allow farmers to come and set up farmers markets on this particular land so that it responds to food insecurity that's happening in the area, so that it also helps support the work that farmers are doing, and it gives people access to locally sourced foods. I think a lot of times when we go to restaurants and we're looking at menus and we see on there that it says, different foods are locally sourced. Well, this is what we mean, locally sourced, because we are supporting the work that the urban growers and the farmers are doing. It's their livelihood. And at the same time, we're responding to food insecurity in our areas. And so I encourage churches to do that. You can start by doing a community garden on your land. That's something that my church did in the midst of the pandemic. When that store closed after 30 years in our area, it then became a question for us of how do we respond, and particularly because our area had so many elderly people. It's like, well, let's look at this land that we have that we're not doing anything with. It's just a lot of grass out here. And so how do we turn this into an opportunity to be able to make a God response? And so we started a community garden and have all kinds of fresh produce that people can have access to. And so I think that's a great way for the faith community to think about, what does the church have that they can steward well? A lot of churches have commercial kitchens. So how can you utilize your commercial kitchen maybe 2 or 3 times a week and provide meals for people? They don't have to necessarily be free meals, but they can be at a reduced rate that's affordable for people in the neighborhood to come and have. It's something that I've seen other cities do, and it works well because it becomes a natural part of saying, this is how we do community. This is how we do generosity, is by responding in this way. And so I encourage churches to think about that. And then third, of course, is the outdoor blessing box. This blessing box is something that's accessible 24/7. So you don't have to worry about somebody coming into the office or saying, oh, I'm sorry, we're closed from 12 to 1 and you'll have to come back to get food. There's a blessing box that's out there that's available, and it's stocked with food. The only thing is, of course, it wouldn't necessarily be stocked with produce because it's not refrigerated. But there are churches that do the community fridge program where they have outdoor refrigerators that's stocked with produce and milk and eggs, and people can just come up and get whatever it is that they need. So there's so many opportunities.
What's that organization, like Funky Town Fridges or something like that?
Yes, Funky Town Fridges.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's such a cool idea.
It is. These are ways we can respond. And the other thing I would say is, even I had an opportunity to meet and talk with an El Paso here in Texas county commissioner, and he set this initiative in looking at the county's budget and saying we need to allocate dollars to respond to food insecurity that's happening in West Texas. And so these are models that people can look at and say, if other areas are doing this and responding, then this is something that we can do in our areas as well.
Well, I bet you're giving us so many good things here. This is so good. I want to go one other place, because I think it's I think it's something that you really lean into the book. But I love you to talk to me about salmon croquettes, and so I read this, and you write about these with such fervor and imagination, and and I was reading this, and I was like, salmon patties, because so I grew up in rural Tennessee, and we weren't poor, but both, definitely my grandparents came up from kind of nothing, and anyway, I really haven't had that since I was a kid, but every week as a kid, almost every week, I would say, we had salmon patties. And you wrote about these, and I thought it was just beautiful the way you framed this. Some foods are just closer to the heart and part of our story at deeper levels. And I wonder if you could share a bit about that narrative for you, and how you wrestle with misappropriated foods, such as what you're naming as luxury foods, or while in actuality these foods might have been more like sustenance for particularly rural homes wrestling with poverty, and what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So salmon croquettes are something that I grew up eating as well. My mom always made them. I mean, we had them, oftentimes for breakfast. Sometimes we would have them for dinner. And so salmon croquettes have always been dear to me. I happened to be watching one of the cooking shows on one of the networks, and a person made the statement about salmon croquettes being like considered cheap food, and then talking about how they can take it and sell it in upscale restaurants. And that really bothered me, because I thought, you have no connection to like the story or the people who are eating these salmon croquettes, and to take away like the history of that, and to say, well, let's just go and sell them in upscale restaurants, at this horrendous price that most of us wouldn't be able to afford. Then it really got me to thinking how many of us, men and women across all ethnicities, grew up eating salmon croquettes. And so I literally just posted something on Facebook one day and said, this is what I'm doing. I want to find out from you. Did you grow up eating salmon croquettes? Did you eat them from a can? Do you remember what the brand name was? And do you remember if you called them salmon patties or salmon croquettes? And I have to tell you, Caleb, the number of people who responded was just amazing. I mean, I had upwards of 100 people who just responded and talked about, yes, I had them. My grandparents would make them. Sometimes we had rice. Sometimes we had green beans to go with them. And just to hear those stories, and it said something about that connection for people. And it also led some people to say, you know what, it's been years since I've had this. It reminds me of, this particular time period. And now I feel like I want to make some salmon croquettes tonight. And so that for me really said that out of a struggle that people had, just the sense of connection that it brought, and the sense of family that it brought. And so for me, at the end of the day, what I hope is that rather than people looking at foods and saying, we're going to, take this particular food that is specific to persons who are dealing with a food struggle, and now we're going to take that food and put it over here for people in a place of privilege to have it. It's like, let's instead talk about why people were struggling in the first place, and let's talk about ways that we can help to reduce that struggle. And I think salmon croquettes is the perfect way to be able to do that, because it's such a universal food, and it's so similar across different communities who have enjoyed it and experienced it.
That's fascinating. Hundreds of responses. I would have never that's wild. That's so cool.
Yeah. It was men and women. And of course in the book, I include some of those experiences, and I name the people and name some specific things about them so that readers can see, across the board, across, ethnicities and cultures, like, here are people who enjoyed salmon croquettes as well, and just what that means. And the other piece I wanted to say in there is, it's even in thinking about how salmon was canned in the first place and started being sold in grocery stores, particularly Piggly Wiggly, because again, in thinking about Tennessee, the first grocery store, Piggly Wiggly, started in Memphis, and so just connecting that again for people to see why the salmon was canned in the first place, responding to the Great Depression and just responding to struggles that people were having and continue to have even beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think circling kind of all the way back and thinking about being ecclesial disruptors and, responders to all of this, and maybe you're listening and you don't really feel like you still know where to start. I think this is a beautiful reminder that, that we all raise our hand and say we all, eat, and food is this great thing that reminds us that we are all the same, that in the way that we all eat, at the end of the day, we gotta stuff our faces again, and that food is that sort of equalizer that, I believe that we can sort of sit down at all these different tables within our community around us and have a conversation, with some salmon patties or whatever it is. And, I think that's man, it's, if nothing else, let's break bread together. And I think that's always a good place to return to here, if you don't know where to start. So yeah, thank you so much, Yvette. This is just, so rich.
It's been great.
Yeah. Anything else that we didn't get to that you might want to slide in? It's okay if not. I just want to make sure to give you kind of that space.
The only other thing I would want to slide in is to make people aware of the U.S. Farm Bill. And that is something that's renewed every 5 years. The last time it was renewed was in 2018, so which meant last year it was up for renewal. It didn't happen. It's going to be renewed this year, hopefully. But the reason I want to point people to that is because this is where food stamps and SNAP benefits fall. So the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and persons who are on food stamps, it falls under the U.S. Farm Bill. So it's something that we need to pay attention to because a lot of our neighbors are relying on these food stamps and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance benefits. And it's also where broadband internet is under. And so a lot of times we don't think about the U.S. Farm Bill being something that affects all of us. We think it affects only a certain segment of the population. We think it's just the farmers, but it affects all of us. So I would just ask that our listeners would think about, okay, let me go out here and literally just Google U.S. Farm Bill and see what comes up so that you are well informed on what's happening. Yeah. So I think that's
I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'm going to give a shout out to my friends at the Evangelical Environmental Network. And I don't know if you've connected with them or not, but it's literally, I'll put this in the show notes, but it's creationcare.org. And they've got a whole page right now on the Farm Bill. And literally there's a button that you can click to say, send a message to my congressperson. So I'm going to put that in the show notes because I think this is one of the things, like so much of this, we've just never really, quote unquote, really thought about.
Right.
And man, like this is everything. And I did not realize the internet piece. That's crazy.
Yes.
So it's, and just goes to show, right? It's all interconnected. It really is. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'll be sure to link your book in the show, and I hope everyone gets them a copy. So, because there's so much to learn here.
Thank you so much, Caleb. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're currently journeying through the season of Lent right now, this might be a good time to marinate on some of this in relation to fasting. And may the fast you choose be to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke. So let's keep on. Until next time. And hey, if this is good for you, it's good for me. So share this with someone you love. Grace and peace.